Soil is kind of an interesting thing because it's what you need to grow things properly. What I want to do in this video is talk about how you can identify what's going on under the ground just from kind of looking at it on your property. And if you're a soil scientist, you might try and slaughter me for this, but these are observations that I have had with our 30 acres, and they've proven to be somewhat true. So I can pretty much, walking around our property, look at something at this point in time and tell you whether or not it's going to be a good spot to grow something or if you're going to run into problems. This field behind me is a prime example of that. We live in the Carolina terrain, and we actually are very close to the Triassic Basin, so we've got a little bit of a weird mix going on our property. Neither one of them is ideal for growing because they're very rocky soils with a lot of issues. So what I'm going to do is take you guys around, show you some of the spots on our property where we're having issues and what you can see on the top of the ground to tell you that there's an issue below it, so that you can better understand, if you're looking at a property, what you might be dealing with. And then what I'm probably going to do is do a follow-up. We're going to be taking some soil samples at the end of this month to our county, and the county will then analyze those soil samples and tell us what we could be doing different to help get some of the things that we want to grow in those locations to grow there. But this video is mainly just about what you can tell about your property from just looking at what's there, looking at the ground. Visually, you can tell a lot from looking at a piece of property. This is an area that I have some intimate knowledge of because I just dug about 28 holes out here yesterday. But just from digging those holes, I thought, this would be a prime example of how you can look at land and actually see where your problem areas are. If you look to my left, over here, well, I guess that would be your right, my left, you'll notice that the ground has less grass. It's got a little more weeds, and after the winter time, this is early spring, you've got some patches. Now during midsummer, all of this is going to be green, something's going to be growing on it. It seems like Bermuda grass pops up and grows anywhere that the fescue's not. But we do definitely have some patches here where there's not a whole lot of anything. And then immediately to my right, you can see where there's less patches, there's a lot more green fescue, and there's a reason for that. Anywhere you look up here on this soil, it just rained, so it all looks pretty smooth today. Yesterday when I was out here, there were a lot of cracks in the dirt. And that is a sign of expansive soil, which means that the soil retains the water, and then as it dries out, because it's basically swelled to retain that water, it just kind of cracks up and it looks kind of deserty. And that's the type of soil that's here. But and that soil seems to be all over this side of the property. But what the big difference is between where you see the grass growing and where you don't see the grass growing is the rocks that are under the ground here. You'll notice in these holes, there are lots of rocks, and on the holes to my right, there are very few rocks. And every single hole through this section had rocks. The other side, there were no rocks. With the expansive soils, what will actually end up happening is, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you're mowing your lawn and you pick up all the rocks, a few months later you go to mow it and there's dang rocks in your lawn again. Then you probably have soil that's a lot like this. As that soil expands and contracts, it pushes those rocks up to the surface. Now, back to my right, we have a little bit of an actual drainage issue. The water comes off of that hillside, and then it's supposed to kind of drain down this way. So this area stays a little more moist, which helps the grass, but it also it's kind of created a system of hydrology that's pushing the rocks towards the center and up. And so you have this area in the center of this part of our property right here where I'm sitting, where there's just been a lot of rock buildup and then it's coming to the surface. So if you were looking at this before I dug all these holes, you would be able to look at this and say, you know what, if I dig right there, I'm gonna hit a ton of rocks. Just from looking at the ground, you can see where the grass, the vegetation is just a lot different, it's a lot more sparse. And underneath this ground right here, underneath me, is where all the rocks are. And then as you go off to the right, that's fairly easy dirt to dig into. And really, when I get down a little ways, there's a lot of clay. That's good soil for drainage. So if I wanted to, I could probably plant anywhere from about, well, this line here over and have some halfway decent soil. But we're not gonna be planting in the ground. The reason why I dug these holes is to build a raised plant bed, which you'll probably see videos out on. And because we've kind of just given up on trying to grow in the ground out here. But it still is very interesting how you can tell visually how much greener it is on this side versus to my right. And none of this to my right has anything to do with anything other than the amount of rocks that are underneath the topsoil. And I'm going to show you some other spots in our property where if you look at it, you're going to either be able to say there's a lot of rocks under there, or that soil is holding too much moisture, it's expansive, or you can look at it and say that soil has good moisture content, great drainage, good for planting. And that's going to be the big difference between what we see as far as what's growing there, how much fescues, how thick the fescue is, how much what the weed growth is, because there seems like a lot of weeds tend to grow in rocky areas. And I'm also going to show you there's a few spots on our property where I've planted identical trees but in different soil types. To my right there is an aspen tree. It's kind of planted in a very clay type soil. It's well drained, but it's also in an area that gets a lot of water because it's right where the slope comes down. That aspen has been growing since midwinter. Phenomenal. I planted another aspen in an area that has ground more similar to what I'm standing on, and I'm only about 15 feet from the first aspen tree. That's how much your soil content can change in an area. But I planted another aspen in soil very similar to what I'm standing on, a little more rocky, a little more expansive. That just started growing this month in March. So it's about several months behind the other aspen tree, not growing as strong. At the same time, Colorado blue spruce, and I'm using the aspen and the blue spruce as examples because they're both trees that you see growing commonly next side by side up in the Rockies or similar places. And the Colorado blue spruce that I planted in the more rocky soil like this is thriving. But then I planted a Colorado blue spruce in a more mucky kind of high moisture content, very rich soil, and that seems to be, it's doing fine, but it's slightly delayed. I actually planted a third blue spruce in a soil type that's kind of in between, and that one seems to be thriving as well. So the different types of trees are going to grow well in different soil types. So after you watch this video, hopefully you can, if you're looking at a place where to put a tree in your yard and you read the soil types, hopefully you can kind of look at your yard and say, that area over there is not going to be a good area for me, but that area 15, 20 feet away looks like a great spot for it. And that's what the point of this video is for. So I've decided as I go around and tell you a little bit about the soil on our property visually, I'm going to go ahead and pull my soil samples. I'll do a separate video on how to pull soil samples because there are some people that might want to know how to do that but don't want to watch this whole video. So keep an eye out for that video. I'll post it there when it's done and ready. So the thing that you're looking at behind me is another interesting major difference between two different areas of our property that are kind of right next to each other. You notice down here you see some pretty lush grass growth. You also see a lot of mud, and I'm going to explain that to you in a second. Then up here you see kind of a more thinned grass, lots of weeds mixed in. And this tier right here, we call them tiers because they're different levels. This tier is very similar to our very top tier, which I was showing you had a lot of rocks. There are a lot of rocks here, lots of them, and they come up to the surface constantly. And actually right where I'm standing, which is almost on the same level, also has a lot of rocks. There's almost everywhere I look, there are rocks. And like I said, you can pick them all up. In a few months, you're going to have more rocks in your yard. And that's because the way that this soil works is it absorbs and contracts with water. It pushes those rocks around. In fact, if you watched our video on putting in utility lines, running our well lines to our house, I filled the ditch all around the water line with sand. And I did that knowing that rocks are going to be pushing through that soil. And as they push through, I don't want them pushing through my water line because then I have to do it all over again. So that's an important thing to know on your property if you're building. Do you have a lot of rocky soil? If you do, you need to put some sand in that ditch. Anyway, down here is a little different. And the reason why it's different is because it starts to kind of level off into the pasture. And what happens is all this sediment that is pushed up, because as those rocks push to the surface too, they're also pushing some of the soil up and out, and then that's eroding down the hillside, and it collects in certain areas. So it's collecting here. So this soil, I'm guessing, is going to be a lot richer than the other levels. I'm sure that my my base is probably the same across it all. It's just this has become more of a catch-all. So it's kind of built up a less rocky soil base, something a little richer for the grass to grow in, and because of that, we naturally have richer grass growing in there. The only thing I've done down there is spray the weeds and cut down. You could see a lot of junk growing up right there. All of this used to be trees. A couple of years ago, I came in, cut everything down, and the grass has just grown up really well. Whereas up here, it's real blotchy and weedy, and the grass didn't naturally just come in and take over like it has here. I didn't seed this or anything. This is just what happened. And so we're going to test this area down here and going out into our pasture as zone 2, and we're going to test the soils for these top 2 tiers as zone 1, because I'm thinking that there's going to be a different makeup of what's going on here. There's slightly different characteristics of the rocks, and again, I can see that from looking at these. I can see that this is a rocky area, even though it looks like there's grass over there, because I can see the weeds and the thinness in the grass. I just know from knowing our property that thinness represents a very rocky terrain. And I know down here that thickness of grass represents a very muddy terrain, and it represents a much softer soil. So visually, I could tell the difference between these two. Another interesting thing that we have going on here is right below me here, there's water that's constantly coming out of this hillside and landing right here. We're actually going to build a pond down here because we need a way to trench our water, collect it, and then push it out down into the drainage that runs through the field, which are just basically ditches. So we're going to kind of help remedy what's going on here with a kind of some sort of water feature to collect this water. But water's constantly coming out of the ground right here, which tells me that somewhere between that level and that level, I have a very hard rock surface, which is going to change the soil makeup between these two different areas. Because that hard rock surface, the water is not being able to penetrate through. It's running across, and then it's coming out of this hillside right here and onto this lower level. So it's not actually seeping down into the soil. There's something very hard, rocky surface underneath, somewhere maybe 4 or 5 feet deep below the second tier. All of that I can tell visually just from looking at the property. I don't need a soil test to tell me that, because I can see the water coming out of this hillside, which means that the water is not being able to go all the way down. And I can see the thin grass, the thick grass, all of these characteristics that I'm telling you right now, I know without even testing my soil. The reason why I'm testing my soil is because I need to know what the chemical makeup is here so that I know what I could do different as far as fertilizer up here to get grass to grow. And that is the purpose of the soil test. There are ways to get grass to grow. It's just not as easy. This, if I clean out that junk over there and keep it mowed, the grass is just going to grow naturally. But I'm going to test this area as well because I want to know what makes this area so good. And that's just a matter of understanding your property. I'm going to run 5 soil tests, and I'm going to show you all 5 of those areas and why they're different to me. So now this is another interesting spot to stand on our property because to my right, your left, if you look up this hillside, you'll see that there's some nice thick clumps of grass, but then in between them you've got these big kind of balding areas, and we have a ton of weed growth that occurs on that hillside. But then when you look out to the left, we just have rolling hills of grass. Obviously weeds come up if you don't spray them, but for the most part it's just very grassy. The grass grows pretty well. So over here, I can tell from some of the areas on some of the ridges that there's a lot of rockiness going on. It's probably the same as that hillside, the way it kind of wraps around. I know I've got a lot of rock going on that hillside, but I do everywhere I go. I mean, just right here, if I walk over and, well, those are too big to lift, but there's some rocks coming up out of the soil right over there on the other side of the camera from just being eroded out and being pushed to the surface. So rocks are everywhere on our property. The reason why I'm doing a soil test over there is because I want to see what it's attracting the weeds to that area and preventing the grass from being able to choke them out, as well as the grass does in other areas of our property. You'll see some weeds sticking up in here. A lot of them are kind of dead looking. That's because a lot of what has grown here that's not grass I've been able to kill off pretty easily with spray. These fields were pretty weedy last year, but this hillside continues to be a challenge. And I don't think that the makeup is that much different than it is here, because this area where the grass is a little shorter than it is on that part of the hill, that just means that there's some rock under there. The grass isn't, being able to thatch out in the soil as much as it is a little further down where it looks a little healthier. But that hillside continues to be more of a mess for me. I will say that if you follow this hillside back, as you get closer to that tree back there, you'll notice that the steepness kind of levels off a little bit, and you have a couple little bumps of hills there, and that has created another interesting phenomenon. When we had our soil tests done for the septic system of our house, that spot over there along this rocky hillside turned out to be the best spot. And if it were a little later in spring, you'd see that particular hillside has a little bit of a thicker, richer grass, but it also grows a lot of weeds. And again, that's why I'm doing the soil test, because I want to know why. But when we dug holes, we got an excavator out here and dug big holes that you could just get down into and check the sides and get soil samples. What we found was that naturally along the hillside, sediment would kind of come down and settle in an area, and that's what happened there. And so you do have some richer soil kind of midway down this hill. And what's also interesting is the horses really like to graze over on that particular spot of the hillside. So whatever's going on with the grass there is something they seem to enjoy. I'll see them grazing over here on that hillside. They don't spend a lot of time over here unless it's early morning and they want to be in the shade because it's summertime. I'll see them up in the trees there, but in the afternoon this is all sun. So there's definitely some interesting things going on with this pasture when it comes to soil. But just looking at it, this is supposed to be a visual video. Just looking at it, I know that I'm gonna have a rocky terrain there. I know that I'm gonna have some rocks right in here because of the way that the grass is performing compared to some other spots. But that area back there, if I walk back there, I'm not sure I'm gonna walk all the way over there right now. But that area back there where the grass tends to grow even richer and thicker and taller, that soil has less rocks in it. It has more of a topsoil buildup from runoff collecting in that area. And visually, you can see that when these pastures grow in. You're gonna see areas where the grass gets real high and thick. And you're gonna see other areas where it doesn't seem to grow as well and it's thinner. And those are the areas where our subsoil is rockier. It'll be interesting to see what else is going on when we start digging in and getting soil samples, getting an idea of the mineral content of our soil. We're gonna actually be able to see what the soil is missing, because if I can you can get grass to grow on rocky hillsides. You can get it to grow anywhere if you have the right mineral mix and chemical mix in the soil, the pH balance, things like that. But all of this is different. I'm gonna test the first 2 tiers of section 1, second 2 tiers of section 3. I'm gonna test this hillside here as section 4, and then I'll probably go over to our other pasture and test that one. So those are gonna be all the tests that I do. And I'm gonna do some testing by the house, because by the house, again, it's up on the same hill as the other area. We have some grass growth. We have a lot of rock mixed in. We have a lot of fill soils mixed in from chicken houses and things over the years. So I would say up by the house, we actually don't know what we have going on up there. But if we want to get a nice lawn, we're gonna need to know what that is. But for the most part, our pastures are doing fine. There's just really this section right here that is a real pain in the butt.